Okay, this one I think is particularly relevant. Transformed identity. Members shed their old identities and assume a new identity bound to the group, framed as a rebirth or metamorphosis to a higher or more desirable state of being. New names may be given or assumed, and the prior identity and associations are vilified.
But that grieving process of Boy Dylan was a real thing that my family is still going through very much. And it's weird for me because now I'm feel so successful. I feel so happy. Like I'm like, why wait, speed up from the funeral, babe. Like let's leave that party and come over to this one because this one's a lot more fun.
It does seem really obvious, but yeah. And in terms of the old identities being vilified, the way that people switch to referring to their birth names as dead names, and that idea that the old version of them is dead and that they've been reborn into a new one.
Is that how it's framed? Is that a more recent conception of it, or is that how it's always been?
Dead names? I think that's been around for the whole time I was in the trans community. I'm pretty sure dead name was the thing. And it's actually also like a verb. If you dead name someone, it means you're using their wrong name, their old name.
Did you go right along with this when you were in the thick of it? And that's how you framed it? If somebody called you a past name or prior name, then that's how you would see it?
I would see it as like a form of them not recognizing who I am. I don't know if I would like necessarily think of it as them addressing someone who is dead, but like I did refer to my name as a dead name at that time. So yeah.
This shows up in coercive groups in a number of different ways. You can have something like the Heaven's Gate, where their old identity is completely abandoned and they take on a new name that has ties to their new leader and the new group. And it serves as a form of disconnection and dissociation from their family of origin and any of their prior ways or modes of being, which that makes them more dependent on the group itself.
They were celibates. They were living exclusively for trying to achieve this entrance to heaven, to the next level. And they were given new names. The system that eventually was used by T and Do was to use a single syllable, effectively a first name, and then a shared last name, which always ended in Odie.
And Do said that the next level was adopting us into their family. So the family name was ODY. So I became Soyo.
Hi, Dave Odie. There's Lodi, Alex Odie. There's Vern Odie, Stem Odie, Avon Odie, and Lodi, Dest Odie, June Odie, Golden Odie.
And I fear that that element of disconnection is part of what's happening in the trans community when kids take on a new name and it severs that psychological tie to their family of origin, which we've already discussed. There may be abusive families, but I feel like for a significant number of people, that's not the case. In other groups like Mormonism, you're given a secret new name once you achieve a level in the group itself. And that's in Mormonism, once you go to the temple, part of the initial ceremony that you go involves giving you a secret name, which is held as sacred. It gives you a sense of identity, but it doesn't completely replace your identities. You're able to retain a lot more of your sense of identity from that. So we can see it happen in variable levels of severity, depending on how it's incorporated into the group. How strong would you say that new identity is in the trans community?
I think it's everything. The whole process, the whole point of it is to be able to like live your authentic self. So that identity really is everything. It's holding up everything. So I think that's why when people doubt, then it feels so dangerous to them. I think it feels like a threat.
No, I can relate to that. If I'm discussing with a true believing member of the church and I start throwing criticisms at the church, their identity is so enmeshed with the church that even if I'm not attacking them personally, they'll still feel personally attacked because something that is so close to their self-conception is under criticism. So it would completely make sense that even in this paradigm, that's happened. There's a phenomenon that I think is maybe the result of postmodernism's influence in gender ideology, which is that if you dead name someone, it's almost like you're committing violence on them. And that elevates then the level of how severe a sin that is, that then justifies what types of reprisals that you may be subject to. Is that the case? What do you think? Is there this conflation between words and violence in how this identity is treated?
Yeah. And the first thing I think, of course, is there are cases in law. I know that we're moving towards that direction in Canada where literally this isn't necessarily with names, but if you use the wrong pronoun for someone, then it's literally like a human rights violation, which it seems hard to make.
For the past 11 months, Canadian father Robert Hoogland's now 15-year-old daughter has been receiving testosterone injections by court order. The process began in late February of last year when Justice Bowden of the British Columbia Supreme Court ruled that the then 14-year-old girl should be medically transitioned to a boy regardless of the wishes of either of her parents. While the girl's mother was willing to cooperate, her father was distraught.
This will not change her DNA. She will not become a boy. It can lead to increased heart disease and other risks of that nature, different types of cancers. Because they're going to be stopping her puberty, her bone density will stop right where it is. And I kept saying, no, this is not going to happen. I'm not consenting.
According to the courts, however, Rob's consent wasn't relevant. In fact, Justice Bowden went one step further, declaring that Rob and his wife had to affirm their daughter's new gender identity. Rob was told that if he tried to dissuade his daughter or referred to her as a girl, he would be considered guilty of family violence. The night of the ruling, Rob granted an interview to The Federalist, lamenting the state-sponsored transition of his mentally vulnerable daughter. He also pointed out that his daughter was biologically a girl and would simply have her health impaired by high-dosage testosterone. The interview infuriated the BC Supreme Court. A few weeks later, Justice Francesca Mazzari convicted Rob of family violence for using female pronouns. To make sure Rob didn't refer to his daughter as a girl again, Mazzari signed a protection order authorizing the police to immediately arrest Rob without warrant if he was caught referring to his daughter as a girl or with female pronouns.
But then at the same time, of course, there are so many people that I know that who feel like correctly sexing someone is not a violation of their human rights. So that is the same thing where words have become violence, and they are claiming that just perceiving someone the wrong way is now a hate crime.
Yeah, and that's where dead naming might be different, because it really is going to the name of the person. You can't rely on, well, I'm just using a grammatical construct. It's saying, no, I'm specifically naming them something that they no longer identify with, that maybe is a step above using the wrong pronoun.
It's harder to defend at the end of the day because so many people change their names for reasons that have nothing to do with trans. So if you can call Lady Gaga by that and not by her legal name, then you should be able to call anyone by whatever name they want to be called. Or at least that's one of the arguments anyway. But in that sense, it's a little harder to defend dead naming people.
Yeah. How strong was the new identity in keeping you within the group or the movement? Did it play a role in that?
Did my identity keep me within the group? Sorry,
yeah, the new person that was born out of your membership into the group when you were in that mode of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that was what kept me in it when I was discontinuing hormones, and then I was still identified as trans for like another 4 years after that. I did feel like that version of me was who I was going to be forever. And I wasn't totally wrong in that transition is always going to color the rest of my life. And that's what I was thinking at that time, is that I'm always going to be transgender. I've reframed that now. It's not that I'm always going to be transgender, but I'm always going to be affected by the way transition changed my body and changed other people's perceptions of me. And basically everything I went through, like cognitively and psychologically throughout that period. But yeah, the identity is what kept me in, is what kept me from starting to, I think, criticize after I realized that testosterone wasn't right for me.
Steve Hassan is a popular person who's researched and written about cults, and it's his bite model that a lot of these questionnaires are framed on. one of the ways that he talks about identity is that not so much for people who are born into a cult, but for people who get proselytized or indoctrinated into one, is that they have a pre-group identity that then once they get into the group gets transformed according to this process that we're talking about. But if they eventually unplug themselves from that group, they have that pre-group identity that they can default to. Was it easy for you to resort back to your old identity? Did you go back to your birth name, or did you create, I've heard some people create a whole new identity for their post-transition life, stepping away from it. I don't know if that is common or not.
Yeah, I went back to my birth name, which was Michelle. I'm always really not surprised, but like it's always affected me how often I hear that people in my situation do normally go through it and then they come back feeling like they've been reset back to the person they were before all of this happened. And because I've heard that from so many detransitioners where they're like, I woke up and now I'm 18 years old again when I started hormones, and now I'm going to have to resume developing from that period of time. So for me, like I was a 21-year-old woman, and now I feel like I'm a 21-year-old woman again, even though I'm not. And I've got another dozen years of experience under my belt. But yeah, I went on a tangent because I hear that from so many detransitioners as well, where they feel like they're resuming from their old identity.
How easy was it for you to re-inhabit that old identity? Did it feel like it was something that had followed you the whole time and you were still there and you just were able to allow it to come forward? Or was it like putting on an old suit?
In like the days after I decided to detransition, I did feel different, and I felt like there was a part of me that was dormant that just came back up and took over again. So it wasn't difficult. The difficult part is because it wasn't simply an ideology, it was also the body modification, is
Yeah.
that when that part of me came back up, there was still a disconnect because that identity has reemerged, but the way that my body is completely different. So I have to, I don't know. Sometimes people talk about detransition as a going back, but there aren't a lot of things that I've gone back to or gotten returned to me as part of it. It's really more of a you come up and then you're just like, okay, take stock of everything that's around me. How do I deal with this? How do I adapt now that I'm here? So having that identity back wasn't difficult, but the difficult part was learning basically how to adapt now that identity has returned to me and that sort of feeling of that person of me is back. How do I make my way through the world now that everything else is different as well? Or at least my material reality of my body is all different now.
That's some heavy stuff. And it's the consequence of this transformed identity. What do you want to rate it as?
Severe.